Chapter 4 of The Duke of Chimney Butte. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Duke of Chimney Butte by G.W. Ogden. Chapter 4. And Speak in Passing. The events of that Sunday introduced Lambert into the Badlands and established his name and fame. Within 3 months after going to work for the Syndicate ranch, he was known for 100 miles around as a man who had broken Jim Wilder's outlaw and won the horse by that unparalleled feat. That was the prop to his fame, that he had broken Jim Wilder's outlaw. Certainly he was admired and commended for the unhesitating action he had taken in avenging the death of his friend, but in that he had done only what was expected of any man worthy of the name. Breaking the outlaw was a different matter entirely. In doing that, he had accomplished what was believed to be beyond the power of any living man. According to his own belief, his own conscience, Lambert had made a bad start, a career that had its beginning in contentions and violence, enough of it crowded into one day to make more than the allotment of an ordinary life, could not terminate with any degree of felicity and honor. They thought little of killing a man in that country. It seemed no more than a perfunctory inquiry to fulfill the letter of the law had been made by the authorities into Jim Wilder's death. While it relieved him to know that the law held his justification to be ample, there was a shadow following him which he could not evade in any of the hilarious diversions common to those wild souls of the range. It troubled him that he had killed a man, even if in a fair fight in the open field, with the justification of society at his back. In his sleep it harried him with visions. Awake, it oppressed him like a sorrow, or the memory of a shame. He became solemn and silent as a chastened man, seldom smiling, laughing never. When he drank with his companions in that little saloon at Misery, the loading station on the railroad, he took his liquor as gravely as the sacrament. When he raised them, he rode with face grim as an Indian, never whooping in victory, never swearing in defeat. He had left even his own lawful and proper name behind him with his past. Far and near he was known as the Duke of Chimney Butte, shortened in cases of direct address to Duke. He didn't resent it, rather took a sort of grim pride in it, although he felt at times that it was one more mark of his surrender to circumstances whose current he might have avoided at the beginning by the exercise of a proper man's sense. A man was expected to drink a good deal of the over-ardent spirits which were sold at Misery. If he could drink without becoming noisy, so much more his credit, so much higher he stood in the estimation of his fellows as a copper-bottomed sport of the true blood. The Duke could put more of that notorious whiskey under cover and still contain himself than any man they had ever seen in Misery. The more he drank, the glummer he became, but he never had been known either to weep or curse. Older men spoke to him with respect, younger ones approached him with admiration, unable to understand what kind of a safety valve a man had on his mouth that would keep his steam in when that Misery booze began to sizzle in his pipes. His horse was a subject of interest almost equal to himself. Under his hand, old Whetstone, although not more than 7, had developed unexpected qualities. When the animal's persecution ceased, his perversity fled. He grew into a well-conditioned creature, sleek of coat, beautiful of tail as an Arab barb, bright of eye, handsome to behold. His speed and endurance were matters of as much note as his outlawry had been but a little while before, and his intelligence was something almost beyond belief. Lambert had grown exceedingly fond of him, holding him more in the estimation of a companion than the valuation of a dumb creature of burden. When they rode the long watches at night, he talked to him, and Whetstone would put back his sensitive ear and listen, and toss his head in joyful appreciation of his master's confidence and praise. Few horses had beaten Whetstone in a race since he became the Duke's property. It was believed that none on the range could do it if the Duke wanted to put him to his limit. It was said that the Duke lost only such races as he felt necessary to the common continuance of his prosperity. Racing was one of the main diversions when the cowboys from the surrounding ranches met at Misery on a Sunday afternoon, or when loading cattle there. Few trains stopped at Misery, a circumstance resented by the cowboys, who believed the place should be as important to all the world as it was to them. To show their contempt for this aloof behavior, they usually raced the trains, frequently outrunning those westward bound as they labored up the long grade. Freight trains especially they took delight in beating, seeing how it nettled the train crews. There was nothing more delightful in any program of amusement that a cowboy could conceive than riding abreast of a laboring freight engine, a sulky engineer crowding every pound of power into the cylinders, a sooty fireman humping his back, throwing in coal. Only one triumph would have been sweeter: to outrun the big passenger train from Chicago with the brass-fenced car at the end. No man had ever done that yet, although many had tried. The engineers all knew what to expect on a Sunday afternoon when they approached Misery, where the cowboys came through the fence and raced the trains on the right-of-way, a long, level stretch of soft gray earth, set with bunches of grass here and there, begun a mile beyond the station, unmarred by steam shovel or grader scraper. Man could ride it with his eyes shut. A horse could cover it at its best. That was the racing ground over which they had contended with the Chicago Puget Sound Flyer for many years, and a place which engineers and firemen prepared to pass quickly while yet a considerable distance away. It was a sight to see the big engine round the curve below, its plume of smoke rising straight for 20 feet, streaming back like a running girl's hair, the cowboys all set in their saddles, waiting to go. Engineers on the Flyer were not so sulky about it, knowing that the race was theirs before it was run. Usually they leaned out of the window and urged the riders on with beckoning, derisive hand, while the fireman stood by grinning, confident of the head of steam he had begun storing for this emergency far down the road. Porters told passengers about those wild horsemen in advance, and eager faces lined the windows on that side of their cars as they approached Misery, and all who could pack on the end of the observation car assembled there. In spite of its name, Misery was quite a comfortable break for the day's monotony for travelers on a Sunday afternoon. Amid the hardships and scant diversions of this life, Lambert spent his first winter in the Badlands, drinking in the noisy revels at Misery, riding the long, bitter miles back to the ranch, despising himself for being so mean and low. It was a life in which a man's soul would either shrink to nothing or expand until it became too large to find contentment within the horizon of such an existence. Some of them expanded up to the size for ranch owners. Superintendents, bosses stopped there, set in their mold. Lambert never had heard of one stretching so wide that it was drawn out of himself entirely, his eyes fixed on the far light of a nobler life. He liked to imagine a man so inspired out of the lonely watches, the stormy rides, the battle against blizzard and night. The train of thought had carried him away that gentle spring day as he rode to Misery. He resented the thought that he might have to spend his youth as a hired servant in this rough occupation, unremuneratively below the hope of ever gaining enough to make a start in business for himself. There was no romance in it, for all that had been written. No beautiful daughter of the ranch owner to be married, and a fortune gained with her. Daughters there must be indeed among the many stockholders in that big business, but they were not available in the Badlands. The superintendent of the ranch had 3 or 4 born to that estate, full of loud laughter, ordinary as baled hay. A man would be a loser in marrying such as they, even with a fortune ready-made. What better could that rough country offer? People are no gentler than their pursuits, no finer than the requirements of their lives. Daughters of the Badlands, such as he had seen of them in the wives to whom he once had tried to sell the all-in-one, and the superintendent's girls, were not intended for any other life. As for him, if he had to live out there with the shadow of a dead man at his heels, he would live it alone. So he thought, going on his way to Misery, where there was to be racing that afternoon and a grand effort to keep up with the Chicago Flyer. Lambert had never taken part in the long-standing competition, and appeared to him a senseless expenditure of horseflesh, a